In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Hello, everybody. Good evening, those who are in Iran, and good afternoon, the listeners from the US. Some people may watch us live, some people may catch us later via IJ TV. My sincerest greetings to all of you. Tonight, in the 12th episode of my Instagram dialogues, I have the pleasure to host Professor Hossein Askari of George Washington University, and with me, he will discuss the prospect of U.S. foreign policy. 11 days later, Joe Biden will assume office in the White House. And there are many speculations made about his government, his administration, the kind of policies he's going to undertake. And the one that is of higher interest to many Iranians is the foreign policy of the United States, as his predecessor, Donald Trump, put in place the harshest economic sanctions against their country. So many Iranians are carefully watching the policies of the United States, and they are really interested to know how will the new administration in the US deal with their country. Professor Hossein Askari of George Washington University is a veteran academician with more than 14 books. Countless, now I'm trying to have him with me, countless articles. He's a regular contributor to Iranian media like Mehr News and Tehran Times, also Tahlil Bazar. We are very pleased and honored to have him to listen to his opinions, scholarly ideas. Hello, sir.
Nice to be with you. Hello, how are you?
I'm great. How about you?
Good, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So in the introduction, I said that just 11 days from now on, Joe Biden will assume office. And on Wednesday, people around the world witnessed that the Capitol Hill was stormed by mobs of violent protesters. For many people, especially Iranians and Venezuelans, whose countries have been for years the scene for such events when the U.S. voiced support for violence in the streets of Tehran or in Caracas. So they were very happy to see that the same thing was coming to the U.S. Let's start with the latest events of Wednesday. What is your take, sir?
Well, I think this was building up. It has been building up for not just the 4 years. It has been building up for a long time in the United States. The United States is a country that has been increasingly over time becoming divided along many different lines, along many different lanes. One of those important ones is the haves and the have-nots. I came to the United States in 1963. When I came to the United States, the highest tax rate for the people who were making the most money was 91%. Today, it is 37%. Today, I pay the same tax rate as the university professor as what a billionaire pays. It's become so unequal. And I am a person who believes in the free market, but in America, things have gotten out of control. And so that's why you have, as an example, in Los Angeles, people in the streets without food. You see lines in places like Dallas, in all major cities, people lining up for food. there's been inequality. And I think the way a lot of people see it, they look at one group, they say these are the elite who've gone to the best universities, and some of them have made a lot of money. And then there are the other people who work very, very hard. Some of them have two jobs, and it doesn't give them enough money to pay their bills, put food on the table, to send their children to school, and so on. And so this has been building up. So what happened when Mr. Trump, I think, was running for president and became president, he saw that there was this group of disenfranchised people in the United States. And they're, by the way, largely uneducated, people who did not go to college. There are, of course, some who back Mr. Trump because one of the things that happened during his time was they changed the tax structure and rewarded the very rich even more. So what basically happened, he tapped into that group of people. He exploited their anger because they were angry. And he said, as you probably recall, very well known during the run for the presidency, he said, I can shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and nothing would happen. Because he saw himself tapping into this army of people. And so he did that. And then he told them lies, lie after lie. And if you look back at the history of dictatorships and the rise of someone like Adolf Hitler, if you repeat something enough times, Yasser, people begin to believe it. If I keep telling you it is now, I know it's night in Tehran, if I tell you it is shining bright, and if I keep saying that 100 times, you know, I overwhelm you. You begin to believe it. So he told people lies. And so it got to the point, the sad point with COVID, and then I'll stop talking and let you ask your next question. What happened is that I could see people with their loved ones, with their mothers, father, wives dying of COVID, and a doctor would ask them about COVID, and they would say, oh, no, this is not COVID, this is a hoax. It's not true. So he lied to people, and then when he did not get reelected, you probably saw on Wednesday, he told them, go down to the Capitol, and I will come with you. So this mob went down there, and they took the place over. And now what America faces is, what do you do with all the people who voted for him? Because when they could have stopped these people from these lies, they didn't. And now it's going to be much more difficult. It'll probably take a decade or two to get the United States even back together in some semblance of unity as a country.
So you're talking about injustice, inequality, an unfair system that favors the rich, corporates, lobbies, oligarchs, and corrupt politicians. How this situation will affect the U.S. position as the world's hegemon, the superior power, the superpower that is wielding influence over the whole world. Do you see any prospect of the collapse of the U.S. foreign policy or weakness in the U.S. foreign policy due to its domestic problems?
No, I think, stepping back, looking at U.S. foreign policy, if I may give you some background, then we can talk about the Middle East if you wish. But U.S. foreign policy is driven by national or perceived national interest. And because I say perceived, because I don't think what America is doing and has done is in America's national interest, in my view. If you look at it, America spends more on military hardware than the next 10 countries combined. Now let that sink in. America, one single country, spends more on military hardware than China, Russia, Britain, France, the next 10 countries. This is what General Eisenhower said, the military industrial complex, when he was president. So there's a momentum, there's a force here for military expenditures. And there's a force that, again, Americans have been told a lie, in my view, that we've got to have these military expenditures and be stationed around the world for self-defense. Now, let me step back. I look at the United States. Here's a country. On one side is the Atlantic, on the other side is the Pacific. Up north, you've got a very peaceful country, Canada. They're not militaristically inclined to come and invade the United States. And to the south, you got Mexico, which is not a powerful country. A lot of people, I understand that, but we can contain them. And so when you look at what America spends on this military, and America, I believe, has about 120 bases around the world, we have told the American people we need to do all this because we need this for our security. And so what drives American foreign policy is, number one, is the military expenditures, but number two is the interest that America has in different parts of the world for various things, for markets, to sell its goods, for natural resources like oil, for forestry, for rare earth metals. So it is driven by those national interests, but I don't think we need to be doing many of the things that we are doing. So I think that the change in American foreign policy will not be dramatic. I think a lot of people feel, oh, now that Mr. Biden has come, oh, America is going to do dramatic new changes. No. I think what America is trying to do is to reestablish the alliances that it's had most securely as it had in the past, like with the European countries. Those have, withered a little bit. They're showing some cracks because of the way the United States treated them under Mr. Trump. Because I think one of the things that I firmly believe is that the Russians, Mr. Putin, has something on Mr. Trump. Because it was very, very unusual for a president of a country to be subservient to the president of another country. In that case, the United States relative to Russia. So those things will change. But the overall arching form of American foreign policy will be the same.
So if we say that the US foreign policy is based on the so-called national interest of the United States. So we have, we witnessed something in 2016 presidential election campaigns and debates. Mr. Trump talked about US foreign policy in the Middle East. Mr. Trump is the one who said trillions of dollars of American resources have been wasted in the Middle East. So now the question comes to mind, whether this line of argument is meant for domestic political interest, partisan arguments, or no. In reality, it's a piece of fact that American resources are being wasted in the Middle East. Which one is true? If they are really being wasted in the Middle East, why they are not withdrawing from the Middle East? If now I have this serious question: is the U.S. really benefiting from its military presence in the Middle East or not? That's the question.
See, I said one very important word that you did not try to pick up. I said it's perceived national interest. I'm not saying it is national interest. I think when you look back on American foreign policy, I think number one is very short term. They don't look like the British used to in the olden days, many years ahead. They're not chess players. They're more checkers players. They don't look into the future and look at what's happening. I think what America, in my view, has done in the Middle East, unless if we may, we can focus on the Middle East for a few minutes, is not in America's long-term national interest. I think there were times when, without a doubt, America did things that it got resources from the Middle East cheap. For instance, in 1953, when the British, I think, were the spearheads, by the way, Americans liked the publicity more, when they overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, America managed to get into Iranian oil, because up to that point, it was BP, British Petroleum, Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, whatever you want to call it. But what happened was America, for all these years, managed to get oil quite cheap. So I would say, well, yeah, there was a benefit there. Now, I've never done the calculation, the cost ratio of what would happen, but I think you can also imagine that if the Middle Eastern countries were sovereign nations, if all of the rulers thought about their people and not themselves, what could they have done? Oil, instead of, oil was being sold in the 50s for a few cents a barrel. Oil was cheaper than Coca-Cola. Well, they benefited there. They also benefited by having access to some of these markets. Selling them, when America sells military hardware to Saudi Arabia, it's a big benefit to the American economy in the short run. And so I said, perceived national interest. But in my view, and I'll be long dead, by the way, so we won't know if I'm right or wrong. At least I won't know. In my view, a lot of the things that America is doing in the Middle East is going to have a very harmful effect in the long run on the United States. I believe that America cannot maintain a presence in the Middle East. America, I think, is increasingly identified not as an unbiased broker between Arabs and Israel. It is seen as the backer of Israel, and I would argue that I think Israel drives America's foreign policy in the Middle East. And so in the longer run, I don't think this is a manageable policy for Israel. And the reason I say this is very simple. It's not, I used to be an engineer, Yasser, in my first life. Just look at the numbers. Just look at the numbers. There are 2 billion Muslims in this world. 2 billion. And there are 30 million Jews in the whole world. And, they are telling, with America's backing, they are pursuing policies that I would argue the way that the Palestinians are treated are second-class citizens. It is akin to apartheid. And at some point, it won't be maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. At some point, there's going to be a blow-up in these Arab countries. I don't think people are going to accept that. That's going to cause a problem for the United States. I don't think Americans will have the stomach to send 1 million troops to the Middle East. And if anyone wants to start a nuclear war, the whole place will go up. The whole place will be destroyed. That's not the way. So it's not a sustainable policy. So I don't believe this is in America's long-term interest. I don't believe this is in the region's long-term interest. I don't think this is in the interest of humanity. I think the only solution is peace and recognizing the legitimate gripes, the legitimate needs of different groups. For instance, when it comes to the nuclear, there's a simple solution that any rational person, anyone with half a brain, would tell you for the long run makes sense. Make the whole Middle East nuclear-free zone. But Israel won't give up its arms. Israel will not agree to give up its nuclear weapons. Why? Because it's afraid of the Arabs. But if they had built peace, Yasser, they would not be afraid of the Arabs. But they've treated them in such a way that now they have to be afraid that if they don't have nuclear, they don't know what could happen. And so that's with the nuclear. With what is happening in the Arab countries, it's very simple. They need change. They need reform. They need some justice. And by the way, if you look at Islam, which is the religion of the whole region except for Israel, in Islam, it is very, very clear. Allah gave mankind freedom. No one has the right to take that freedom away. If God had wanted to make you a machine, he could have made you a machine, and me. But we were given freedom. And in Arab countries, like in Saudi Arabia, a country that I know something about, there is no freedom. And so what you're seeing is America backing dictators in Arab countries, number one, backing Israel. And I'm saying that none of these are sustainable. They're not sustainable. What America should be doing should be really working towards peace. But it's not doing that. Because if you take what America does by selling arms to Saudi Arabia and backing them with intelligence, and what Saudi Arabia has done in Yemen is criminal. So, these things will have a blowback effect. And I think it's very, very sad. I think America genuinely, there's some people who believe what they're doing is in America's national interest. I'm saying it is not. It is in the short-term interest, perceived. And it does benefit certain people. Don't lose sight of that. It's not just the arms companies. There are many people in this country, and in Great Britain as an example, Mr. Blair, Tony Blair, who have very large consulting contracts with the rulers of these countries. Now, none of them no American gets a contract with Angela Merkel in a democratic country. But if you come to Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman decides whatever he wants. If he wants to give you $1 billion, he gives it to you. There is no checks and balances. There's nothing. So America likes to support these dictators for its economy, perceived, benefit direct of certain people. And I don't think this is a good policy in the long run. Short run, some people are benefiting. And I think that if you go back to a former American president, when they were talking, he said, son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. So, when you look at you control that dictator, it's much easier than dealing with parliament in a different country. If, let's say, a Latin American country, there were some rules, regulation, order, and there was a parliament to check the prime minister's views, it's tougher to get your way. But if there's only one man and he's in your pocket, it's easy to do it. So America's done these things, but I think increasingly over time, they will become unsustainable. And I'm sad for that because I think that's going to cause problems in the world.
You refer to Israel and US on unlimited support for Israel. Some people argue that the reason that the US-Israel partnership is because of Zionist lobbies in the US. There are Jews in the US which are rich and powerful, and they are wielding influence over the US government. To what extent do you agree with this justification? What is the reason that the US is a number one supporter of Israel, regardless of the apartheid status there, regardless of violation of human rights? Can you hear me, sir?
Yes. I'm listening. Yes.
The question is, why is it so? Why does U.S. Has a relentless support for Israel?
Well, I think you have basically addressed the question yourself. I mean, I think there have been books written about this by some eminent political scientists in the United States, Jewish, by the way, who then became ostracized. Teachers at the University of Chicago and at Harvard, they became ostracized and attacked by the Zionist lobby in the United States, because the Zionist lobby clearly has an impact. Let me just give you a very, very blunt example, and then I will elaborate. I have been a professor for 50 years before stepping down. I can tell you that if you got up on any campus and you said something against the President of the United States, nobody cares. But if you start attacking Israel, very quickly you get the label of being anti-Semitic. People, they don't allow you here to distinguish between Zionism and Judaism. You know, and so they've managed to lump that together. And the people who've done that, I think you're right. If you look at some of the major donors to presidential campaigns, are in fact very rich Zionists. And I think that that has in fact done a great deal of harm. And as an example, the only American president who's kind of tried to stand up for Arab rights, Palestinian rights, without a doubt, none of the others, I don't care, Mr. Obama, is Jimmy Carter. And, you know, poor Jimmy Carter has been raked over the coal because of that in this country. You know, you got to have guts to stand up. And so they've gone after these people. Anyone who stands up against Israel, they've gone up with a stick. And so one of the things that you also have to ask yourself, if I may, you say there are rich people who back Israel in the United States. You're right. But ask yourself another question. You know, there are rich Muslims all over the world and in the United States. Do they do anything? Nothing. Zip. So ask yourself why that is. I can't answer that one. I mean, if you look at it, there's some very, very wealthy Arabs, very wealthy Iranians, not just in the United States, but around the world. But they don't do anything like this. Whereas I think that the rich Jews who are Zionists, because not all Jews are Zionists, please understand that. Some of my beloved teachers were Jews, but they were wonderful, wonderful human beings, unbiased humanitarians. So, yes, you're without a doubt right. That is the thing that drives American foreign policy. And I think, please understand this, that a politician in the United States needs money to run. And if somebody gives you money, you back what they want. And it's been done very, very crassly in other cases. It's not just, by the way, about Israel. It's done for various policies. And they even get the people, when they back them, to sign that they're going to follow a certain course. So money is in American politics. And what has ruined American politics has been money. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Money has really tarnished the conduct of American policy, both domestic and foreign, by the way, not just foreign policy.
And do you think that there will be a change in U.S. foreign policy in regard to the war on Yemen, the Saudi war on Yemen, during Joe Biden's presidency? I mean, I'm talking about the next administration.
Oh, I think that there will be not a change in everything, but in the case of Yemen, without a doubt, I think Joe Biden will insist for Saudi Arabia that any backing, any security agreement will be conditional on certain things. And I think Yemen is one of them. I think some improvement in human rights is one of them. But you know why? All of these changes have occurred very, very rapidly over the last year with Israel, between the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Saudi Arabia behind the scenes, because they realize one thing, exactly the question that you posed, that Mr. Trump could be persuaded to do anything as long as you manage to channel some money into his companies or promise him some money in the future. But Biden is not going to be that way. Biden is an honorable man. And so I think for Mr. Biden, he's going to insist that Saudi Arabia, as an example, changes policies in Yemen and domestically. And so that's why in the last year, they managed to make deals with Israel. The reason is, if you want to now, they realize that if we're going to lose Trump, we need someone to ensure that we have backing in Washington, D.C. You know who can do that better than anyone else? Israel. And so that's why they rushed to Israel, because they don't care about Palestinians and Arabs and any of those kinds of things. They are only concerned about their own survival. And they believe that they need US support to survive. And so they're all making up with Israel, because Biden will change that part of the equation. Absolutely. He does not want to be the president of a country that supports, for example, a man who killed, dismembered Jamal Khashoggi. And America is identified with that. I mean, you know, because they still support the guy. I mean, you can't walk. I mean, everybody else has condemned and said something. But America, you know, Mr. Trump kind of, you know, as he said famously when he was running for president, you know, during the last 3 years, I don't remember in which year exactly, they asked him a question about Saudi Arabia. He said, "Oh, sure, I love them. They buy my apartments. Of course I love them." Biden is not that way. So I think those things will change, yes. But don't think that Biden is going to come, and we can discuss this if you wish, and embrace Iran as an example, and say, "Oh, you were mistreated by Mr. Trump." He's going to move very, very slowly, and I can explain why. And I think he's not going to change the support for Israel. I think Trump went, without a doubt, overboard about Jerusalem and about the expansion of those land grabs in the West Bank. But I think that what you will see is, you know, he'll change, but it's not going to be a total change.
And I read somewhere that you said in April 2019 that there will be another round of Arab Springs in the next 5 or so years. Do you still think so?
I'm sorry, you froze. I didn't get that at all.
I read somewhere that in April 2019, you said that there will be another round of Arab Springs in the Middle East in the next 5 or so years. Do you still think so? And do you think that the US will have a role in it?
Well, I think that, you know, for me, many of these countries can be compared to a pressure cooker. It's going to explode at some point. I don't know when. I guess 5 to 7 years, but I can't tell you exactly. If I could, I would. They would call me something special. I just don't know those things. So I think there's going to be an Arab Spring. I absolutely do believe that. I think it's maybe different. And let me tell you, the last time around, what started in Tunisia would have swept across, and it went to Egypt, as you know, and to Libya and so on. It would have swept across the whole Arab world if the Persian Gulf countries, the Arab Persian Gulf countries, had changed. But why they held firm was for two reasons. They had money and they had America's support. And as a Saudi prince told me one time, I won't mention to you his name, but he mentioned to me, he said, you know, you Americans are mercenaries. As long as we pay you, you do anything. And so I think those are the things that held those countries together. If they had gone, there would have been wholesale change across the Middle East. Now, I think that why the Arab Spring failed in the countries that it has, in Egypt, Tunisia is having a very, very hard time. Although everybody says that's the big success story, it's having a hard time economically and so on, is that you cannot expect people who have had no power, zero, to come on day one and do great things. It takes time. Look what they did after the French Revolution. They killed so many people. It was horror. It took time. I mean, the French act very civilized now, you know, we are this, we are that. But, you know, it takes time. And I think what happened in the case of the Arab Spring, number one, these people had no experience. And number two, the Arab Persian Gulf countries, they made sure it didn't go succeed. Because they knew that if it succeeded, guess what would happen to them? They would be swept aside. So they were working to make sure that these things did not succeed. In Egypt, they poured billions of dollars, into Egypt to make sure it didn't succeed. But I think that this will happen again. I think they have a little bit more experience than they had the last time. And so I don't know if it's going to be smooth by any means, but there are going to be problems. I mean, if you ask me what makes sense, if I could give advice to anyone who would listen, nobody listens to me, by the way, so it's okay. But if they would listen to me, I think what would make sense is that you take two countries which are, share many similarities. Iran and Iraq, if they could learn to really cooperate, help each other economically, and cooperate, I think they could significantly change the whole landscape of the Middle East. But each one has its own internal problems, especially Iraq, and it has not happened. So
let's touch upon the US-China trade war. What will happen during Joe Biden's presidency? How do you see the prospect of US-China relations during the new administration in the White House?
Well, before I say that, I think that it was a shock to all of us that a trade war started, because no one wins in a trade war. I know Mr. Trump said stupidly, oh, I will win this war. You can look at the history of trade wars, because one escalates, the other escalates, and all that happens over time is that the level of trade just keeps going down. So there was a shock that this, in fact, happened. But Biden is coming into this at a time people are struggling in the United States, not the very rich, by the way, but the blue-collar workers, so-called. And Biden's also said, as an example, that, oh, we will build sustainable energy. We will build this and that, but we will buy American. So he's realized that he cannot go the other way and reverse everything of Trump's. He's got to slowly try to bring those down so that people do not attack him domestically, and politically, and say that he has given up American manufacturing jobs to China. It's got to be a slow improvement in trade relation with China. Because remember, America has another election coming up in 2 years for 1/3 of the Senate and all of the US Congress. And if Biden loses either of those two houses, he's finished. He can't do anything. So he's got to have some of the populist support that he is keeping American jobs at home. I don't think that makes sense for me, but I think, yes, he will improve trade relations with China, expand them, but not like this, all of a sudden, everything. It will be a much more measured restoration of trade with China. But I think that given how Trump has demonized China and said all of these things about China, Biden has to be careful. He's got to tread carefully. But I don't think that the trade war with China will get worse. I think it will, in fact, slowly, measuredly, go back slowly to where it was. But it will take time.
Okay, so this is about trade war. How about the rivalry between US and China? Because some people are arguing that China will overtake US position as the world's hegemon or the superpower by 2050. What do you think? Do you think that China will be able to overtake US?
Yes. I think there are many reasons. I mean, this is not very scientific how I'm going to respond to you, but I will give you my answer. I have had students from all over the world. And I was very blessed. I had a number of very bright students from Sharif University. And I used to tell them this, and not one of them disagreed with me, by the way. I said, you guys are just as smart as the Chinese students, but they work harder than you do. And they all agreed. Now, they also said some other things, which I won't repeat here, but they agreed with that notion. The Chinese work very hard. When you go back to the time when I was going to school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you hardly saw an Asian-looking person in Cambridge and in Boston. If you go now, it's filled. If you go back, again, 40, 50 years ago, in the academic journals, once in a while you saw an Asian Chinese name having written in those high-level journals. Now, when you look at it, it's filled. What I'm trying to tell you is that a lot of people look at China and say, oh, it's got a big economy. China's got a lot of, at other levels, it's going to compete against the United States. It is in science, in its economy, depending on how you measure it. Today, it could be larger than the United States, by the way, depending on how you calculate the size of an economy. Its military still is not the same. I mean, it's got a long way to catch up, not in numbers, but in sophistication of the equipment. But without a doubt, I think in the next 10 years, China will dominate Southeast Asia. I mean, there's no, America's going to have a hard time keeping a real strong presence there to be able to combat China. I think that globally, by 2050, China, I think will, we're getting increasingly now to a very strong bipolar world, America and China. But I think that each year that goes by, China's strength relative to the United States is going to go up. I can't tell you it's 2050 or whatever, but I think it's very important. I think that's one of the reasons why the United States was very unhappy that Europe the EU, signed a trade deal with China. And so it's the reality. They did it. Biden is upset at that, apparently, but they're looking for the reason that you say to the future, and they see that the future is much more likely to be with China than with the United States.
So China is a growing superpower now. You're saying that now we are witnessing a bipolar situation in the world. Something interesting is happening in the Middle East. China is increasing its presence, its economic presence, its military presence in the Middle East. How do you see the dynamics of the region, the Middle East, with China trying to have a bigger share, bigger, size of influence there, and the U.S. Is losing its status there? So how do you see the Middle East with regard to the rivalry between China and the U.S.?
Well, I think, without a doubt, again, China's influence in the Middle East is going to increase. There was a time about, I would say, 5 years ago, that China was doing certain things with Saudi Arabia, I felt, under the table, behind the scenes. But I think more recently, it has got much more overt relations with Iran. And I think that it's more likely that American troops will eventually leave Iraq. And so I think China's future in the region is much more likely to be on the side of Iran and Iraq, as opposed to Saudi Arabia and Egypt or anyone else. So I think that is the shape that you're going to see, is in fact with Iran, with Iraq, Syria, allied with China. Not next year, because I think in the case of Iraq, it'll take a while. But I think in a few years' time, and I think America will be allied with Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf countries and with Egypt. I think that's what the future looks like to me. However, it's very, very important that I point out something to you, and this is a very personal feeling. I'm not saying that this is in the world of politics, and I could never have been a politician, because I also let my heart dictate to my head, whereas a politician is supposed to have no heart. They just let this rule their way. I think what China has done to the Muslims, the Uyghur Muslims in China, is despicable. They have been put into camps, they have been mistreated, and I would have a hard time if I was a Muslim living in the Persian Gulf to ally myself with China and keep my mouth shut. I would have to, before I could get very close to China, I would want China to change those policies, because I think they're wrong. And I think that the same goes, by the way, for India. I think you're seeing some Middle Eastern countries ally themselves and say nothing. They keep their mouth shut when it comes to India. But India has mistreated Muslims very, very badly. And as you probably are aware, after Indonesia, India has more Muslims than any other country. It has about nearly 200 million Muslims. And so I think that if you're going to have a close, foundational relationship with the country, you at least have to have some agreement on your basic philosophies, basic socio-political outlooks. And I think that China should change that. And I think if I were Iran, I would raise that issue with China. I would try to stand up behind the scenes. I don't expect them to do it openly on television, but behind the scenes, I think there's got to be some improvement in the way that Muslims are treated in China.
And how do you think that Biden's administration will deal with Iran's nuclear file?
Well, this is the most interesting one, and this is probably the last question you probably want to get into. You see, when people destroy something, they really do destroy it. It's not easy to wake up and put it back. When something's broken, you can't just get up and put it back together again. I feel, if I may give you some background, at least of my thinking, when the JCPOA was agreed to, I thought it was flawed. I think from the Iranian perspective, in my view, Iran made a deal that was flawed from Iran's perspective for this very important reason. What Iran was giving up, some of it, was not reversible very quickly. Namely, what Iran gave up, as you know better than me, it gave up its enrichment. It exported the enriched uranium it had, and it poured concrete into this heavy water reactor, which was the other way to make a nuclear bomb. And I don't say Iran wanted a bomb, but if it wanted, it could have done it through plutonium. But Iran poured concrete into that. What did America and these guys give up? Nothing. They said, we'll lift the sanctions and we'll give you some of your money that we've frozen up back. But they could always snap those sanctions back immediately. I don't know if I've made any sense. So it was not a balanced thing. And then from the other perspective, the Western perspective, they felt that their deal was flawed because there was that sunset clause that after a period of time, Iran could go back to what it wanted to do, enrich uranium. Again, I don't know if Iran wants a bomb. I don't believe they do, but at least they would have the capability to have one. Now, when Mr. Trump came and he withdrew the United States and reimposed sanctions, really, let's just be frank, the Europeans did not stand up. They said, okay, well, sorry, we can't force our companies to deal with Iran. They're scared, so we're sorry. But they did not stand up to their part of the agreement either. And so then America, Mr. Trump started bringing up new excuses, which were nothing to do with the JCPOA. Why does Iran have missiles? We want to get rid of their missiles. Well, I'm sorry. If Iran got rid of its missiles, I would tell Iran, you're being irresponsible. You're encircled by US forces, by Arabs. They've got, I'm sorry, much more sophisticated arms pointing at Iran. You've got Israel there with everything known unto man and God. And Iran is supposed to say, okay, this is a wonderful neighborhood. We don't want anything. We'll just play soccer and forget that. It was unrealistic for Iran to give us missiles, but they never raised that before. Now they've raised that. Now they've raised, we can have our soldiers in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Bahrain, but you cannot have any alliances with Lebanon or Syria. It's new demands which make no sense. Now, what I think is going to happen, and on this I'm willing to make a bet with you, that Biden is not going to say, okay, let's go back to where we were. He's not going to do that. He's going to raise some of those same demands. Iran's missile. He's going to say, you go back to where you were before we take sanctions off. Now, if I were Iran, and you will say it's easy for you, you're sitting there having your coffee and you don't care, but I do care. But I think if I were Iran, I would say, we did not withdraw first. You withdrew first. So you've got to put everything back. And then we will put everything back. But getting rid of our other programs like missile is off the table. If you're willing to withdraw and make sure that the Arabs and Israel have no missiles, then fine, we'll do the same. It's got to be balanced. You cannot rely on purely goodwill. You've got to be smart, and you've got to realize that Iran is vulnerable. Iran lives in a very, very dangerous neighborhood. And so Iran has got to be on guard, and they're going to demand those things. So it's not going to be an easy road, Yasser. It's not going to be an easy road to go back and restore the JCPOA. And I would even argue that Iran could legitimately raise another issue, which is, look, when America withdrew, our economy was damaged. Let's do a calculation. What was the damage to our economy? So you go back, get rid of the sanctions. Let's agree to what compensation we should get, because, you know, damage was done to Iran. One has got to be realistic. Compensate us for the damage that was done, and we will get rid of the enrichment and get rid of anything we've enriched. And if you want to talk about missiles and anything else, let's sit down and discuss those in a different context. That's a separate thing. Might just make one final point. I hope I don't offend you, and I hope I don't offend Iran, but Iran is not very good at getting global publicity in its favor. You need people who can get on the television and media outlets everywhere, who are charismatic and who can present Iran's perspective. In the United States today, whether you want to believe it or not, and I think this has been a mistake, and it's been driven, and this is the whole different topic why this has happened. The average American sees Iran as enemy number one, not China, not Russia, Iran. Poor Iran. What is Iran? It's sitting over there. What can Iran do? But because of this publicity, and this has been hammered, and Iran has got to understand that to win that global publicity war, they've got to get their act together, not just being able to defend themselves militarily, but they've got to get their message across. What has happened to Iran?
Can you hear me, sir? Professor Askari?
No, I just heard you. Yes, go ahead. Yes.
I think there was a technical issue. We missed your voice. Now you are saying that Iran is not having a good publicity in the US to convince the American public that Iran is not a threat. Iran has never done anything to harm US interests. And, that was what you were saying, yes?
No, I was saying 90%. I said that the bad publicity, absolutely. I think that they think Iran is enemy number one, which is, in my view, not true. Of course, Iran has done certain things that American thinks has hurt US interests, but America has done many things to Iran too. So it's tit for tat. But Iran has been harmed. I mean, if I may just, if we have another 3 minutes, if I may just give you a long list, what I would come up with is the 1953 coup, what that did to Iran. Number two, I would come to the Iran-Iraq war, without a doubt, America gave Saddam Hussein the green light. And what that did to Iran was disastrous. Number 4, I would argue that it was available. Everybody knew this, that the Western world gave Saddam Hussein outlawed chemical weapons that were used to kill Iranians. That's a war crime. And he killed enough Iranians that was reported by American reporters. He laid Iranian bodies in the Far Peninsula and the tanks went over them. And then after all that, Iran cooperated with United States in Afghanistan. Iran had been the country that had supported Shah Massoud all those years. Iran also, under General Soleimani, fight ISIS. Now, there were times, and let's just be very frank, Iran did all those, but also Iran did some things it had no choice. It had to retaliate here and there to the United States. It couldn't just lay back and always help Iran because the United States, because after Iran did all that, if you recall, President Bush put Iran on the axis of evil. All of a sudden, Iran was on the axis of evil. And so what I'm saying is that Iran has done some things that it should not have done. That's the whole discussion. But Iran has also cooperated with America. America has done some very, very harmful things to Iran. And one of the things is both sides cannot be either side. They should not be a prisoner of their past. They have to get over their past and look to the future. But I think Iran is, I'm sorry to say it again, is not very good in getting its point across to the rest. It is as enemy number one, and Iran has got to change that image. It has really got to change that image. I mean, I'll give you one example and then I'll shut up.
No, sir.
No.
Enjoying it.
No, I'll give you one example. A gentleman who I like a great deal in Iran, who used to be your foreign minister for a while, Mr. Kamal Khadrazi. He's a very smart man. But if you look at Kamal, he hardly ever smiles. You've got to be able to, if you want to appeal to people, you've got to have some charisma. You can't just kind of be pan-faced. But you've got to, it's not your foreign minister, you've got to do things that result in that. And until you get the backing in the Western world that Iran, in its history, is in quotes, a good country, things are going to be hard to change. I promise you, they're going to be very, very difficult to change. So,
thank you very much, Professor Hossein Askari of George Washington University. We really enjoyed the time with you. We learned a lot from your opinions. It was my pleasure, and I'm sure the pleasure of my audience, both those who are watching live and those who will watch later via IGTV or YouTube. If there is any concluding remarks, sir, if there is nothing left, we can say goodbye. But if there is something left, you can do the last touch.
No last touch, just to thank you for the discussion. And I wish Iran and the Iranian people a blessed year in 2021. And I hope things get better and people are safe. That's all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We really enjoyed your company. Tomorrow, exactly the same time, we will have David Kitching, political analyst from Dublin. He will touch upon the issue of Brexit. Thank you very much. Catch everybody later.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.